At the moment, or as you can see, we've been building the Western Balkan Competitiveness Data Hub, which is a project we did with OECD earlier this year. Click. There we go. The team of this project, it initially started with Chris and Tanya. Tanya is there. Chris is on vacation. And then Mookie joined the project kind of later to help with the mobile development. Flo joined, she's there, for project managing at the beginning of the year. And then myself joined for development, and Tom, who's sitting there, joined to help with the development towards the end. Yes, bit of an overview of the project. So the project was done with OECD. It was done from 2023 until this year. We did the release in June, and this was like a pretty full service project. We did conceptual design for them. We did like design work, information design, development, and then eventually deployment. Yes, and you don't need to like read the little link at the bottom there. I'll have a link at the end for you if you want to like check it out. So a bit of context around this, like why is this important? So OECD has like a very important role in like assessing economic competitiveness. And here specifically the Southeastern European Regional Program helps to communicate like the role of these economies and how they're improving to boost competitiveness and regional integration into like, or for the Western Balkans into regions for the EU's agendas. So typically what this has meant is that like for the last number of years, every 3 years, they've produced these sort of PDF documentation reports. And this has helped to like kind of communicate this. But this year, alongside their report, they really wanted sort of a digital twin. So here at IXT, like we helped turn this 246 PDF into a 1,163 page website, which consisted of various like hero visualizations and details for different economies and policies, and allows people to better navigate the report as well as share it with other policymakers. So now some demo time to kick this off. So here is the beautiful Competitiveness Data Hub. Here on the home page, the sort of like crown jewel of it is this like main visualization. So here you can see all the different data points for the various policies that OECD sort of tracks. We have various interactions for the hovers here. You can also kind of filter by the different economies to see sort of different trends, as well as click in to see the sort of like historical amount. So like I mentioned, there's the 3 reports, and so we have the data for these 3 reports. You can navigate to sort of see and find more information. And if I go to environment, then you can drill down even further by going into the policies themselves. So here we have the sort of policy page. So again, we have like explanations around what OECD is tracking with this, as well as like similar visualizations. And then for each policy dimension, there are a number of subdimensions. So each of these subdimensions has various scores for them, as well as various indicators that make up these scores and key findings. So this visualization could also then be narrowed down for specific economies, as well as with various key facts related to the specific policy. If I go in, and then you can drill down even further by going into the indicators themselves, and each indicator is made up by a number of levels. These levels are set by OECD and are scored variously depending on whether the economy has like achieved them or not. And again, these can be selected and highlighted. And then the sort of final piece I want to show, if I can click on it, we have various sort of like explanations and explorations into the actual methodology. So you can kind of like read through on how OECD is actually doing their work, like how they do these sort of calculations. what the various like stats and metrics are, to understand this. Okay, for now, I think. Jump back.
Smoothness.
Smooth.
There's more.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, we're done now. Okay. Okay. So the sort of like main reason for this presentation though is like we want to kind of explain to you the kind of challenges and solutions we had in creating this. Like it's beautiful, it's done, but like the real interesting part I think is like what we learned along the way. So this for the first sort of like challenge solutions that we have was on the issue of data quality. No, these are for you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, hello everybody also from my side. So firstly, the issue we had with data quality and also the challenge that we faced here was that they wanted to release the website at the same time as they released the reports, meaning that we didn't have the data up front. Data would only be available approximately a couple of weeks before the release. So of course this was a challenge, but we managed to work around this because we had the data from the previous years and we knew the rough estimates on how many dimensions, for instance, there would be. We knew there would be 2 to 4 sub-dimensions for each of these dimensions, and we had sort of the overall frame on how this would look. You can see on the right is sort of a schema on all these different layers that you have seen in the final product. So it gets quite complex, and there's a lot of data there, but still we managed to work our ways around it with mock data and the data from the previous years. But still, this turned out to be a tricky part in some of the edge cases as well, because we couldn't anticipate for all these cases with the data sets before or with mock data. But we'll get to this in a second. Yeah, then because of the original or the previous data that we had, we were able to sort of put this on a table and create this architecture, which stayed pretty consistent throughout the whole process. This is actually quite an old mock-up from one of the first workshops, but this really represents what we have built in the end, except for maybe some smaller adjustments. And also with the data that we had from the previous years, we developed the hero visualization, the visualization that you saw on the home screen, which is really the top level where we visualize the 15 different dimensions across these 6 economies. And these were just some drafts I think Tanya and Chris have worked on in the very early phase. And you can already see the one on the bottom right is what direction that we eventually went with, which was most pleasing and also had this nice shape of a bridge, which was a nice symbol for the region because it sort of connects 2 points. So the symbol of the hero visualization is actually quite fitting to the overall concept and the topic. And then something more technically from Lloyd again.
Yes, so I'm gonna kind of take over for the sort of more technical topics here. So like we've mentioned, like the data wasn't coming through, or like it wasn't available at the beginning, but we still need data to actually build the application. So one of the solutions we had was to create these sort of like modular templates, which were sort of XML files, like Excel sheets, and then developing these sort of pipelines where we could take this Excel file and manipulate it into the JSON information that we needed for the website. And sort of like creating these pipelines, we were able to update the templates as the data came in sort of a rolling fashion, and then continuously put them through the same pipeline, hopefully producing the same JSON towards the end. This was like quite useful for keeping things like agile, and we could still change the templates before the data sort of arrived. Next one. The other sort of approach or solution we had was to create the entire application very atomically. So rather than trying to create like the whole web page without the data, we would instead use tools like Storybook to create very small modular or very small atomic pieces of the website using mock data to build up all of the edge cases and information using mock data. And then like as the information came in, the actual website would be able to kind of like stick it together. And to sort of demo this, I have all the demos, I just realized. This one. I think it's this one. So this is our beautiful storybook. Here you can see the main hero visualization, but obviously not with the correct data. So this tool let us really dive into like adding what information we were expecting to coming at the end, as well as playing around with what, say, single series would look like, multiple series, how to select series, as well as like extreme examples on how the component will like adapt to various data things when it eventually came in. This obviously wasn't just done with the main hero visualization. We had slope charts and scatter plots, multi-line charts, lollipop charts, gauge charts, and bar charts to do the same thing. And this tool like really helps us to literally just define the data. You can see here, like a value and an economy, and very granularly specify what the application would need when the data was eventually delivered to us. And I can share again. Yes.
Yes. Another big challenge that we faced throughout, actually the whole process from the from the start of the project until the release of the project were different geopolitical topics. Of course, as you can imagine, especially within this region, it's very sensitive. So we have to be very cautious with flags, imagery, borders, and state entities. And I can give you a couple of examples here. So the screen that you see on the right looks fairly straightforward, but there's actually multiple discussions that went to this screen, but also any other screen. For instance, the first example was in the very beginning, we had lots of flags that we used on the country pages, but also on parts of the navigation. But in the we were reminded by OECD that we should not use the flags as they can lead to tensions. And we then used the categorical color palette that we used for the visualization, also a sort of visual language that we used across the pages to also identify these 6 economies. Another topic was with imagery. We don't have a lot of images on the websites, but we did want to feature like an image of an impression of an economy by visualizing or showing one of the cities. And there the initial briefing from the client was that we should take images that don't have any religious objects on them. But of course, as you can imagine, it's really hard to find an image of a city in that area without a mosque or a church. And you can see the 2 images on the right definitely have at least one of them in. So it took us a couple of iterations to find something that wasn't too prominent and that we could get an approval on. Yes. Another thing, of course, was borders. On the left side, you can see one of the key visuals from OECD, from their Southeast region team, department, I'm not sure what to call it, that they reuse across multiple websites and brochures, etc. And we wanted to replicate this and use this sort of 3D globe that you see on the right. Initially, I also wanted to maybe display regions for these economies with the country borders, for instance. But that was also something that they advised us against. Even in this simplified format of this dot map, it was still better to use pins or dots just to mark a rough location on where the areas are. And one of the more tricky scenarios was on the indicator pages. So you see a screenshot of the indicator page on the right with this table that we have where you see different criteria and if they're implemented or not implemented for each of these economies. And there's actually a sort of an edge case for Bosnia. We were informed quite late in the stage that we need to split the data set for the different entities that are within Bosnia. So I'm not an expert on the topic, but apparently there's the state of Bosnia, and within there are 2 autonomous regions, which are the Republic and the Federation of Bosnia. So we needed to split the values specifically for Bosnia into these 3 different values because they could be implemented in one of the entity, but not in the other, and vice versa. And also the state would be then the top layer there, representing the values on the other layers and on top in the dimensions and sub-dimensions. And lastly, probably the biggest learning or flaw also from us and the project team with OECD was by the time we released the website on the launch day, this is how the visualization looked. And then we were reminded by one of the users that we didn't plot all the dots, and we were like, hey, okay, this cannot be. And we checked and we realized that the issue was actually that with the updates from the data set that we received quite late in the stage, we had lots of identical values. So that we had, for instance, one economy and the other exactly on 3.9, which would mean that with this visualization, we would have them exactly at the same position, meaning that you don't see one of the dots. And then, of course, we had to find ways around this. It wasn't too big of an issue because on the website, we have still many options to filter or hover where you still see the information. But of course, in static assets, you would miss this information. And actually, the quick fix during the day was that we just highlighted a certain economy on a dimension just to please the certain user. But of course, we had to fix this issue in a different manner that was pleasing everybody and yeah, was correct. So we ended up placing the dots that were overlapping sort of off axis, as you can see on the right, just to manage to also show exactly overlaying dots in this scenario. Yes, and I think then again for you, Lloyd.
Yes, so again, I'm going to be the nerdy one here. So I think like specifically to a data visualization crowd, this is like a particularly interesting problem. So for the visualization itself, you essentially have two variables. You have the categorical information of the policy dimension, and then you have the score of the specific economy. And so in order to plot these 2 points, we would calculate the radian angle of the like off of a specific angle, as well as the radius away from the center. And this would sort of like give us these spokes and these sorts of points. But then when you're trying to sort of like manipulate this in order to see the different points, there's always sort of like a risk when you just add an X or a Y coordinate that you end up sort of truncating or skewing the data. So if we just moved it up or down, depending on if you went up or down, it would look like the score was lower or higher depending on what the angle was. And so we could actually get around this quite easily. So the important one is the tangent calculation here, where from the angle that we got from the policy, we could actually add a pi over 2, which gives you a perpendicular angle. And then by adding like sort of a random offset of, I think in our case, it's like 8, +8 or -8, depending on the position of the point. And then using vector math to add these two together, you end up with one angle, which gives you view true or vector true. And then you can get two, which are vector plus and vector minus offsets. And then you basically add this to here and you get your new points. So in this case, like we were able to solve the situations where there are two overlapping points, but very important to note is this only works with two overlapping points. Thankfully, at the point that we were making this adjustments, we had the data, so we were able to look and see and make sure that this was working. But if you have your own project and you have more than two, good luck. Yes. Yeah. Good. And then sort of the other sort of issue that we were having here is we had, like we mentioned, these sort of like hover interactions. And typically with sort of a scatter plot, you would use something like a Voronoi representation in order to have areas around the data points that when you scanned over the mouse, it would sort of highlight the closest point to you. And in sort of a standard Cartesian representation, this works fairly well, but because we have this sort of like categorical representation in the spokes, it meant that certain data points, if I can highlight, for example, this one here, ends up getting more representation in the hover area than it should. So because there's nothing below it, it's very easy to select this data point, but very hard to select this data point. And being data visual practitioners, we want to give like sort of autonomy to every single data point. And so we put our heads together and we sort of came up with this way of clipping the interaction area. So it uses the same Voronoi underneath, but then it clips the radius around. So no point too far away from anything else becomes too easy to select. But then we have all this sort of like extra interaction space. So what we did was we added the ability to highlight an entire category or entire policy. So when you were hovering over a spoke or like an axis that wasn't close to a data point, it would do a secondary interaction of highlighting the information there. I can demonstrate this. This is also why Storybook was so amazing. So here we have an isolation with our kind of debug mode on to show these sort of highlighting. And if I zoom in, okay, so here we have a fairly tight cluster of points, which would be quite problematic if certain points were able to be selected easier than others. But here we're able to fairly easily select all of the points. And when we're selecting ones that are on the outside, all the points are now represented. So you see how it's selecting all of them, and then you get this additional annotation then when you're over top of something else. Sorry. And sort of to like demonstrate this in Storybook, this worked as well on the filtering. So when you were filtering just for one economy, we would disable the Voronoi on the points not selected. And again, you would have this sort of like easy to select, easy to find points based on this like interaction. This one I do recommend if you have more points overlapping.
Yes, and next, and I think last challenge that we mentioned in depth was with the different channels that we had for data consumption. So in the initial briefing and in the beginning of the project, the main focus was always the desktop experience of the web experience that we were building. As Lloyd mentioned previously, there have been PDF reports, and the main task was to turn this into an interactive web experience. But throughout the whole process, additional, I'm going to say different channels were added in the sense of the mobile version being more and more in the focus, and also some physical assets and maybe a slideshow even, just to briefly show. We did create the visual with the priority on desktop in mind, also showing all these hover interactions. Of course, you would have a hard time replacing this on mobile, but we still ended up finding a way to make it possible and not just limit the information that we show on mobile. But so what we eventually had is we still kept the hero visualization because we wanted to keep it in the page as sort of a main visual representation and for recognizability also of the website. But we sort of added an additional mode to really go in depth and look at the values with this Explore Dimensions button, so that you could basically zoom in and have the visualization on top and have basically a list at the bottom just to go through all the dimensions. Technically also possible to scrub across the values to see their label with the representing values on it, just to also be able to view this here. Additionally to that, of course, we had the PDF reports, but these were all coming from OECD and we simply had to link them. So this was not really a concern for us. And then as it got later and later in the process, they were also asking us for support on the launch day. They had a conference type of launch at OECD in Paris, and they wanted to make some marketing assets for the Competitiveness Data Hub. And so we supported with one being this physical giveaway, which was this piece here. I'm gonna put these also on the table afterwards if somebody wants to have a look at them, which was basically a teaser for the website, but also just showed the main visualization. And secondly, also another teaser for the website, but a bit more explanatory, was this fanfold flyer that they requested, also as sort of a giveaway for the event itself. And we also did sort of a slideshow. It's not too good of an image, but this is at OECD in Paris the day of the launch. These are all conference rooms, and in one of the rooms was the launch. And yeah, you don't see too much in the video, but there was also sort of a slideshow going on there just to get people into the topic and make people scan the QR code to look at the website. And these are also just a couple of impressions. There was also a booth on the right, top right. You can see these reports that have been printed out. Also a desktop device where somebody of OECD was presenting the product. And also, again, some of these physical assets that we produced for OECD. And as you can see, with all these assets added, there was more and more focus on the mobile experience, because obviously all of these have QR codes, meaning that people will use their mobile phone to scan it. So this was definitely something that we hadn't anticipated, and maybe would have shifted our focus a bit less from the desktop version earlier on already to the mobile experience. So we would fine tune this a bit more, but nonetheless, I think we managed to find a way to make both of them work. as equal as possible. And now I would hand over back to you, Lloyd.
Thank you. Yeah, so just now for some sort of behind the scenes tidbits from like this whole sort of process. The first was obviously like our participation in the event itself. Here we have a wonderful picture of like the team and some of the partners at the OECD Chateau after the event. I personally was not there, but I hear it was a fantastic time. And I think like a very sort of proud, like poignant moments to finish off like a project like this. Some sort of like interesting information about this. So obviously OECD is a pretty high profile client, and so there are some interesting sort of like pieces of information, I think, like in this sort of like collaboration. So first we were like super happy that OECD was so willing to take risks and be a good product owner and make like quick decisions. However, with such like a large organization with multiple teams, so for example, there were 12, 15 policy dimensions, and OECD has a separate team for every single one of the policy dimensions. So when it came down to collecting the information towards the end, when reviews needed to happen, it meant that you needed to coordinate with 15 different teams and 15 different project leaders. So this is definitely a challenge, but like also fantastic learnings. The other like interesting thing is obviously with this event, it's a very high profile event, important people are coming, and that means deadlines are not very flexible. And when things are happening and they need to happen now, like it involves people like Tom, like jumping in last minutes to develop stuff on the fly in production, which is scary, but also impressive. Like saying that as well, though, you know, it's an excellent way to like sort of celebrate the successes of the project, and fantastic to watch it being used by so many users like right in front of you. So then sort of like key takeaways around the sort of like solution or challenges and solutions. So like we've mentioned, like data quality was one of our challenges. Like the data and the content just simply wasn't available at the beginning of the project. And one of our solutions was creating this pipeline to ingest data for validation and parsing. And while this was like fantastic for flexibility, like we were able to develop the app essentially without any data, it also meant that it was very adaptable. So as we were developing the app, if there were certain times when we realized our templates weren't working, we could simply make the modifications, make the changes to the templates, continue on without too much pushback. The sort of negatives to this was that the reactivity after the data was available. So the client would have the templates, they would fill it in. We realized there was some sort of like issue there. And then it was this sort of more coordination back and forth where we needed to sort of make adjustments where needed, rerun it through the pipeline. And this whole thing becomes like quite kind of time consuming. And there's also like a fairly sizable upfront cost in development to building the pipeline at the beginning. So this, I mean, this is just sort of like the nature of like what we built. In the end, like there are tools like databases and CMSs, which their whole cell is basically to alleviate these sort of like stresses in reactivity and time consumption. But we would have lost out on this flexibility and adaptation, which for our use case was really what we were looking to like benefit from.
Yes, one of the other key takeaways for data quality, for geopolitical sensitivities. Obviously, like I mentioned, the challenge here was that each economy wanted to be more in focus, or was always a bit of a competition going on between them. But still, I think we found a good solution in having a balanced representation and trying to align them all in an equal way to please everybody that was involved. So definitely pros here were accessibility. So in the end, we found a way to make all the data visible on all devices, nonetheless of overlaps and whatever, but also correct in the sense that we don't distort the data to a certain extent by adapting the visual or something like this. But of course, one of the cons being that the whole nuancing process of having maybe an adaptation in the indicator table for Bosnia, but not all the way through on the top layers, was something that we had to discuss with the client here. and also sometimes some compromise solutions where we had initially I don't know, a border and a globe, and then it turned out to be something different than we had imagined. But of course, this is something we have to live with. And secondly, or lastly, also data consumption wise, as I mentioned, desktop first was always mentioned, but in the end turned out to be less and less in the focus. But nonetheless, I think we found ways to adapt to the new mediums that were added to the project, and were flexible enough to use this then by the final output. And I think what definitely helped was that we were able, especially for the mobile version, to prototype and quickly see, okay, what can we improve? How can we make this work on mobile specifically, but also for other physical assets or the slideshow, and manage to have an equality between the different. Of course, desktop still working a bit better, but still there's the same amount of information and everything is accessible on both sizes. And yeah, one of the cons here, of course, we had some consequential decisions that were made early in the process that limit us a bit and made it a bit less easy to adapt, but still we found a way. And yeah, maybe the focus in the end was a bit more towards mobile than we would have wished for, but still I think turned out well towards the end. Yeah, and then maybe to conclude, just I think one last slide, if I'm not mistaken, on these three topics that we outlined before. We don't always get the final data in the beginning or when we design, but it's important that we are iterative and optimistic throughout the process in the design, but also adaptive and defensive in developing it. And also, we prefer to have a balanced and nuanced representation of the data. But our audience from the economy might want to simplify some focus representation, so they will also challenging, but I think interesting to see. And lastly, yeah, we can get very focused with just one medium or resolution, but it's important that we think of ways on how it's viewed outside of our mind, or also outside of what the client has briefed us with. Yeah, and I think then we're through, unless I forgot something, or Lloyd, do you want to add something?
Good.
But then I guess we would open up for discussion or question. And yeah.
If there's any questions online, just feel free to throw them in the chat and Benji will help coordinate them to us. And with that, I think we're done. Yes.